Good morning, and thank you for joining the Eagleton Institute of Politics for a conversation with Professor Sahar Aziz on her new book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. My name is Ava Majlesi. I am an associate professor of professional practice at the School of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Political Science. I also serve as the associate director for the Miller Center for Community Protection and Resilience. Our guest today is a professor of law and Chancellor's social justice scholar at Rutgers Law School. Additionally, Professor Aziz serves as an Eagleton faculty associate and was just named a 2021 Soros Equality Fellow. She is the founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can read Professor Aziz's bio on the event site to learn more about her professional accomplishments, but we will also touch on many of those points during our talk today. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the students in my Introduction to Critical Intelligence Studies course for joining us today, and I'd like to welcome our other audience members as well. For those in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will get to audience questions time permitting. Professor Aziz. There you are. Hi, always great to see you. Congratulations on your new book, and thank you so much for taking the time to discuss these important topics with us today.
Thank you so much, Professor Majlesi. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the Eagleton Institute for inviting me, and thanks to all the students and everyone else who's online for taking time out of their busy schedules to listen to what I think is a really important conversation.
Great. All right, let's jump right in. Please tell us a bit about your background. Your parents emigrated to the US from Egypt. What prompted them to come to the United States, and what life lessons did you learn from your parents and your family?
Yeah. Well, if when you read the book, you'll find in the acknowledgments that I recognize my parents because I am like many, the hundreds of millions of immigrants and children of immigrants that have come since the founding of this country. To the United States, oftentimes the majority of whom are looking for economic opportunity. Obviously, there are some who are coming as political refugees, but the vast majority of people who have left their homeland, who have left their native language, their families, their comfort zones, their cultures, and even being members of the majority religion to come to the United States have done so at a very high cost, but in pursuit of economic opportunity, and to some extent political freedom, but I think economic opportunity is probably a larger driver. So my parents came in the late 1970s, seeking to pursue their studies. So my father has a PhD, and in that regard, I recognize my family's privilege of being highly educated, and that certainly was something I benefited from as a student, right? Whether it was a K through 12 student or a college student, having my father have a PhD, and also my mother who has a college degree. And being a religious minority, being an ethnic minority that really translated into being a racial minority, especially after 9/11, gave us different experiences. The way that I experience America in my intersectional identity is different than someone who may be of European origin, who may be a fourth generation American, who may be in the middle or upper middle class, and who may be Protestant. Okay, so if you think of that, tends to be the majority group in terms of being fully represented and sometimes overrepresented in politics, in elected office, in business elite, in the educational elite. And so that gives you a different perspective, and that certainly shapes my scholarship, and it shapes how the lens through which I conduct my research and wrote this book, The Racial Muslim: When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom.
So tell us a bit more about early life for you in the United States. Did you at any point in time experience prejudice yourself? Did your family experience prejudice?
Oh, absolutely. It's just a matter of how one experiences prejudice. It's very connected to multiple factors. So the first is the context matters. Are you in an urban area or a rural area? What part of America are you living in at the time? What's your social class? And then what is your immutable identity? Identities, I should say. We all have multiple identities, whether it's your gender, whether it's your religion, your race/ethnicity, and that shapes, informs, and defines the ways in which you'll experience mistreatment that can sometimes cross the line of being illegal, because unfortunately not all mistreatment is illegal. And what I talk about in the book is before 9/11, things were much more complicated and nuanced insofar as if you were Muslim, oftentimes you were invisible. And insofar as people didn't know what a Muslim was, and I cite a lot of polls in the book, and there was one poll before 9/11 when people were asked their views on Islam or Muslims, 64% said, we don't know what that is. They just didn't know anything. After 9/11, everybody knew, and unfortunately, their knowledge was very negative, or their perceptions were very negative. And so if you look at the polls again that I cite after 9/11, you have approximately, it can go as high as 50% to as low as 40% of Americans who have unfavorable views of Muslims. That translates into answers to questions such as, would you like a Muslim as a neighbor? No. Would you accept a Muslim as the president of the United States? No. Would you want a mosque in your neighborhood? No. Right? Those are the ways in which unfavorability or unfavorable views of Muslims was measured. And then, and again, at the risk of being partisan, but the polls speak for themselves, when Trump was elected and when he ran for office, the people who openly supported him or disclosed that they supported him, the number went to 60 to 70% of unfavorability towards Muslims. And in some ways that explains why he was, unabashed in issuing the Muslim ban and unabashed in stating things that were very explicitly Islamophobic and anti-Muslim. It wasn't even dog whistle politics. And again, I talk about that in the book. I also talk about it in an article called A Muslim Registry, the Precursor to Internment, because few people remember that he had openly called for a special registration program for Muslims, which we had right after during Bush for about 10 years until Obama dismantled it. The laws are still in the books, but Obama stopped enforcing it or operationalizing it, which was called the National Security Entry-Exit Special Registration Program, also called NSEERS. In any event, so yes, I have experienced it, but it just depends on where you are and at the timing. And so the book is really trying to unpack that for Muslim identities, and so that people can understand that although we aspire and we're taught that religious freedom is a fundamental American principle, we're not meeting that commitment. And this book is an alarm bell. It's meant to be a wake-up call and say, at least if you're looking at the experiences of Muslims, particularly after 9/11, and to some extent before 9/11, and certainly if you're looking at African-American Muslims, there's no question that they have faced all forms of discrimination based on their intersectional identities of Black and Muslim. It's no coincidence that the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and many of the Muslim African-American civil rights leaders were very aggressively targeted and scrutinized by the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover's era. But my book is primarily, and I explicitly stated as such, a deep dive into the experiences of what I call Muslims who immigrated to the US and their children and grandchildren after 1965.
So we're going to get into more detail about what life was like in the aftermath of 9/11, but I want to make sure that we touch on your educational background. You mentioned that your family had the privilege of being very highly educated. What about you? Tell our audience a bit more about your own educational background.
So I have a bachelor's in management information systems, which is not very common when you go to law school, and especially if you become a law professor. And for those who are from the Middle East and North Africa or familiar with the cultures of the region in the contemporary era, every culture has certain professions that are considered high status. In the US, medicine is a high status degree, law is a high status degree, and there are others. Pharmacy. And similarly, in Middle East and North Africa, which remember, when you're raised by parents from a certain part of the world, they bring with them their cultural norms. And this is one of the challenges of being, I call myself a 1.5 generation American. I am an immigrant. I was born in Cairo, but I was raised in the US. So my entire formative years, all of my education, kindergarten all the way up, was in the United States. So I'm certainly a product of US society and certainly US education. However, I lived in a family where my parents were a product of the Egyptian society and the Egyptian education system in a particular era, right? During the Arab nationalist era, during the post-colonial era, which is its own kind of really interesting historical part of the Middle East that I encourage those to study if they're interested in the region. And in that society, and I would say it's still the same today, although not as pronounced. If you're an engineer or a doctor and a pharmacist, I would say those three, it's very high status. So I ended up doing a technology degree. And then I got a master's in Middle East studies after living in the Middle East for a few years and working there for an American company. And then I did a law degree. I did a JD MA at University of Texas in Austin. So I have multiple experiences. I've been in different fields, and I consider myself fortunate to have been able to take 3 years between undergrad and law school, because that certainly gives you a very different perspective when you're in law school and challenging what on the books doesn't match with reality. So it's really important. I say this to students all the time, especially those interested in law school, and I hope we have many students in the audience right now interested in law school and hopefully interested specifically in Rutgers Law School. I'll make my little recruitment pitch. Is I always encourage students to take a minimum of 1 and maybe even as much as 3 to 4 years to work and really understand how the world works to some extent. And then when you come to law school, you find your critical thinking skills are much better because you can compare what you have lived in society as a professional, with a college degree, compared to what you read in books and in cases.
I think that's great advice. Thank you for sharing. So let's fast forward to your experience on 9/11. You were in your second year of law school when 9/11 happened, and it seemed like suddenly all eyes were on you. What impact did that have on you? How did 9/11 and its aftermath affect you, your family, and the trajectory of your career?
So actually, I was a first-year law student, and it was my second week. So it was even more formative. I went to law school with a very particular objective because, again, I had worked for 3 years. I had lived in the Middle East because of my heritage, and I had visited Egypt frequently, and I've continued to visit Egypt. And those who have not, I encourage you to visit. It's a beautiful country with very kind and generous and hospitable people. But I was very interested in the region, and I had just finished my master's. So my goal was to work on rule of law, democracy, and human rights and women's rights. And I was very much into women's rights at the time as a young woman attending graduate school. And I wanted to engage in international human rights work, right? And then 9/11 happened and everything changed. It wasn't even a choice anymore. It was such an existential threat for our community. I can't even begin to describe it because it shook us to the core. We went from being, and I say this in the book, from this quasi-invisible minority to this hyper-visible national security threat. Everything we did was under scrutiny and misinterpreted. All sorts of religious words and phrases that are very common in Islam were now viewed as the language of terrorists. Allah, Allahu Akbar, which is God is greatest. That's like saying hallelujah. Alhamdulillah, which is thank God. We say that all the time. Inshallah, God willing. There are all sorts of words that anytime anyone said anything, people would get nervous and think, oh my gosh, is this person about to bomb something? It was that hysterical. I remember I had always kept a Quran in my car. This is kind of considered a way of, it's a tradition that a lot of religious Muslims will have, is they'll have a Quran in their book as a way to kind of bless bless their trip, right, for safety. I took it away because now people, before nobody really knew what that was. You see some Arabic script and nobody really cared. But with the media being so negative, always about Islam and about Muslims and only showing the American public this terroristic, this securitized portrayal, then when people saw Arabic or when they saw a Quran, they thought this person is a terrorist or they're about to do something dangerous. So we were afraid that our cars would get vandalized, and we took them off. A lot of young women did take off their headscarves. They were afraid of being physically harassed and assaulted, and many of them thought, well, I'll never get a job. It was already hard enough to stick out as someone who wore the hijab, but people weren't necessarily perceiving that as a threat. They might perceive it as you're not assimilating, or you need to explain that, or this is odd. But being perceived as a threat is a much more, it's a different level of feeling like an outsider. Also, our mosques, we started to be very concerned with informants infiltrating our mosques, which was confirmed with multiple media reports, and I discussed this in the book. So we didn't feel safe in the mosques. And then later, over time, it started with feeling that the government was scrutinizing us. And then it didn't take long before the public got kind of this green light, this positive signal that it's okay to suspect Muslims and it's okay to harass them because that was patriotic, because that's what a good citizen does. And then we would start having, this was all in the news, but this was ironic, the farther away we got from 9/11, the more we started to get, and remember, I'm living in Texas at the time, these far right-wing groups who would hold protests, and the chants were, Islam is terrorist, these are terrorists, get them out. There were also, this went on for many, many years, unfortunately. It wasn't even just right after 9/11. But all that is to say that when you are a first-year law student and you're worried about your own parents, my mother wears the headscarf, and my father both of my parents have thick accents, but my father in particular, his name is Muhammad, has a very thick accent. You are suddenly focused on that. And something that's important for people to know, 20 years later, things have changed so much in the Middle East, North African, South Asian, children of immigrants, and now we're getting into the grandchildren of immigrants, again, those who came after 65, and I'll tell you why 1965 matters in a minute. We didn't have that many lawyers because law is a low status profession in the Middle East and North Africa. And I think to some extent, maybe not as much in the Indian subcontinent, but it's a low status profession because when you are in an authoritarian state, good lawyers that are highly competent are usually the ones who challenge dictatorship. They're the most equipped. They know the laws, they know the Constitution, they're trained in oral advocacy, they're trained in challenging power. So by design, many of these countries, they're authoritarians, whether they were civilian authoritarians, military authoritarians, or monarchies. They intentionally weakened the legal profession and made it where the lowest performing students in high school will go to law. And they crowded the law schools so that no professor could adequately teach and produce a high quality lawyers. So all that is to say, I was one of very few people who were in law school. And there's even less people that were lawyers. 20 years later, things have changed significantly. But that for the last 20 years, I have been working on what is now become its own field, unfortunately, which is called post-9/11 discrimination. And I've also started at Rutgers Law, as you know, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the first civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses on the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, which crosses religious groups and also crosses racial and ethnic groups.
So in the aftermath of 9/11, what should the government's response have been? What should they have done differently, in your opinion?
A lot.
I thought you might say that.
There's a lot to unpack because there were multiple things that were happening at the same time after 9/11. And oftentimes what we focus on is simply the crisis, which it was a crisis. It was the biggest, most devastating, and most lethal terrorist act on US soil. That is not in dispute. And absolutely the government had to respond. And I don't think anyone didn't want them to respond. The question is, how do you respond, correct? And historically in the US, whenever the perpetrators of a crisis, whether it's a real crisis or a manufactured crisis, if you go back to the J. Edgar Hoover days, many of these so-called domestic security crises were manufactured for political purposes, especially in the Cold War context. However, in this case, it was a very serious and very real terrorist attack and threat. But when this happens, if the perpetrators are minorities, ideological minorities, religious minorities, racial minorities, time and time again, the government comes down very aggressively and punitively and collectively punishes everyone in that group unless they can individually prove their innocence somehow. Whether it's literally having to go to court and prove your innocence, or whether it's more socially and politically having to prove your innocence, such as, and this is what Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians did, putting flags up on your businesses, switching the Quran for an American flag on your car, having a lapel that had an American flag, and going above and beyond to prove I'm loyal, rather than be treated like any American citizen or resident, which is to presume you're loyal unless you've done something that would cause someone to question your loyalty. Because the very fact that you're here obviously means you have some loyalty to the country. And again, if you have illicit intentions, which obviously there are some people, then that needs to be based on your behavior, not your identity, right? And so, for example, the Patriot Act was passed too fast, 45 days, over 350 pages of an act that amended hundreds of other statutes to effectively give the federal government more power on enforcement areas that touch on the civil liberties of all Americans. The political message was, this is really to help us stop Muslim, Arab, South Asian, or Muslims, but South Asians and Arabs were conflated into this definition of Muslims. And the understanding was, oh, it's okay. You can pass this law in 45 days without barely any deliberation, much less having read the statute. I highly doubt that the congressional leaders who voted for it almost unanimously read the statute, because we know that you're not going to target us. And who is us? So it created this us versus them. And us is a hierarchy. And this is where, so I am a critical race theorist. I've been a critical race theorist probably since I was in high school, just not knowing it. But at least formally was a critical race theorist when I entered the academy. And critical race theory, one of the theories is, and this is Derek Bell's theory and Joe Fagan in sociology, is that at least US society, and I would argue other societies too, are based on a hierarchy, right? A social hierarchy, a political hierarchy, an economic hierarchy that interact. And the only reason it's called critical race theory rather than critical class theory or critical gender theory, and there are those kind of literatures, is because in the US, because of slavery and because of what I think is genocide of the Native Americans or near genocide, that race is a master category. And one of the goals of critical race theory is how can we make that no longer a master category? And therefore, if you are of the majority group at the very top, then you are least likely to be harmed by these types of laws like the Patriot Act, because the political system and the economic system and the social system protects you. And if you're at the very bottom, you're the most vulnerable. And Muslims after 9/11 went from being somewhere in between, the black and if white is at the very top and black is at the very bottom, to being near the bottom. So they became collectively punished in various ways. The other thing I would say that the US did, and we all know this now in hindsight, but remember when you were in 2001, 2002, 2003, all the way to 2005, I was among the civil rights advocates that were very unpopular because we were challenging US foreign policy. We should not have gone into Iraq. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, and we all knew that, and anyone who studied the Middle East knows that Saddam Hussein hates Osama bin Laden because Saddam Hussein has always found the quote unquote political Islamists, whether they were the nonviolent or the violent groups, to be a political threat to him. We also knew that invading and occupying Afghanistan, one, was not in America's interest, as we just saw as we pulled out, having spent tens of billions of dollars to no avail. The Taliban is back in power, as opposed to going after specifically the people who were responsible for 9/11, and then figuring out how, and not using it as a way to engage in imperialism. And so that was the critique, particularly from the left, is that this was really a excuse, right? It was pretext for an agenda, a foreign policy agenda that had existed since Gulf War I under Bush Sr. Because Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz had pressured Bush Sr. to go to Baghdad after they liberated Kuwait from Saddam's illegal invasion of Kuwait. And Bush Sr., to his credit, because he had been former CIA director and he understood, he didn't have an exit strategy. And he knew that it was going too far and it would be an endless war. So he said, no, we're going to stick to our mission, which was to liberate Kuwait. So they were just finishing the job and using the son, right, who was not in any way, in my opinion, well informed about international relations, much less the Middle East and North Africa, to finish that job. And again, there were all sorts of collateral consequences for Muslims and Arabs in the US, because by having a similar identity, a religious identity, an ethnic identity, an immigration origin identity, you were just presumed to have dual loyalties. No, people, the government and the public thought, who are you loyal to? Rather than assuming, well, if I'm here, then obviously I have some loyalty to the US. Unless you have some evidence of my behavior, my individual behavior, to show that I'm engaging in something illegal.
So I'd like to turn to the assimilation of Muslim communities in America. Your book describes 4 types of Muslim response to life in America. 1, religious radical Muslim. 2, secular dissident racial Muslim. 3, secular radical Muslim. And 4, former racial Muslim. What are these different approaches, and which one best describes you and your family?
First, any theoretical frame or topology is flawed. There is no perfect theoretical frame. I mean, those of us who engage in theory, the goal is trying to make sense out of the world, trying to find commonalities through certain events and activities to provide some analysis, some framework through which to understand things that may seem disconnected, or things or events and actions and phenomena that may seem chaotic. So my topology, the racial Muslim topology, is an attempt to try to explain something that we all know, which is that not all Muslims, or not all minorities, or not all of those who are, again, at the lower end of the racial religious hierarchy, are going to be treated the same. And that's why you get people who are honestly will come and say, well, I'm Black and I haven't experienced ABC forms of civil rights, or I'm Hispanic, or I'm a woman, or I'm a member of LGBTQ. Again, I'm just using communities that are not at that top of the social, political, economic hierarchy. And they're not lying, because they themselves may not. But the question is why? And maybe some of it is good luck, but let's just assume there's some structure to it. Because the way that hierarchies work is they self-preserve themselves. Anytime there's power, the power wants to stay in power. And therefore, there are certain, what we call kind of conditional, it's called the racial bribe, which is what Gerald Torres and Lani Guinier call in the Miner's Canary, which is a great book I would recommend that came out around 2002. And effectively, the system says, well, we know that we're a nation of immigrants. We know that we're diverse, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the historical moment. And we don't really have a native population, except, well, we do, but we've killed almost all of them. And then we have 13% of our population whose ancestors came forcibly, right? They were brought here forcibly as enslaved peoples. So we have to have some tolerance. But at the same time, we don't want to change the system. So we are going to have the good women, the good Muslims, the good Blacks, the good, there will be groups of people that will be acceptable and tolerated. And then they will be used against those who are a threat or perceived to be a threat to the system. We want to change the system such that that hierarchy is going to be switched around, or maybe it'll be flattened, right? That certain people will not have privileges that are related to their immutable characteristics. And in the case of Muslims, the talk was good Muslim, bad Muslim. And I thought that was, its dichotomy was reductivist. And I wanted to complicate it. And again, a lot of this is based not just on my research, but also as my time as a civil rights lawyer, as a civil rights advocate. I spent 7 years in DC after my law degree and worked pro bono for multiple civil rights organizations. I also worked as a senior policy advisor at the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, where I was actively engaged in trying to fix things from the inside, which is not easy. But I learned quite a bit, and I always tell my students that you should always learn the other side, because I had spent most of my time advocating against government action, and I'm still a critic of government action. But I think it's important to have people who are trying to uphold our civil rights and civil liberties and our constitutional rights, both within the government and outside the government. So I do acknowledge that. And therefore, the topology is really looking at who is the most likely to be targeted by deportation and selective immigration enforcement, torture, surveillance, voluntary interviews, special registration, all of these different civil liberties infringements that have been documented over the last 20 years. And also who is most likely to be attacked either verbally or physically or politically by members of the public, by private actors, by elected officials. So my topology argues that those who are most targeted are both religious. They could be religious and fact. And actually, let me step back. It's all about perception. It's not about fact. And this is where you lose some of that agency when you're an outsider, is people don't allow you to speak for yourself, live for yourself, act for yourself, and represent yourself. No, they just homogenize you into a group. And often it's a group that they have a negative stereotype against. And that's what's so disempowering about it. So if you are perceived as religious and dissident, then you are most likely to suffer all of these negative acts that I just described. Then if you are religious but not a dissident, by not a dissident, I mean you're either apolitical, you don't engage in politics, you don't have time, you're not interested, you're just living your life, but you're religious, you're devout, you go to the mosque, maybe you wear the hijab, maybe you don a beard if you're a man. You pray, you ask for religious accommodation at work and religious accommodation at school. You only eat halal meat. You pray 5 times a day. You fast during Ramadan. So you practice your faith. That, although that's not as dangerous or perceived as dangerous or perceived as disloyal, your religious identity and your practice of your faith, of Islam, is seen as a threat, because the way that Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of these different designated terrorist groups are portrayed in American media to a public that otherwise doesn't have knowledge about the politics of the region and the geopolitics. It's portrayed as if these people represent Muslims. These people represent a religion, not these people are insurgents. They're militias. They're mercenaries. They've been hired in a proxy war. That in the 1980s, America gave them arms. And then in 2000, we now attack them. Saddam Hussein got millions of dollars of military aid from the US in the 1980s to fight Iran. We also gave Iran millions of dollars of military aid to fight Iraq, because we didn't support the Islamic Revolution that removed the Shah, who was a US ally. So the region is extremely complicated, and it's more about politics and geopolitics than it is about religion. Religion is the vessel through which the different actors, state and non-state, that's the ideology that's salient in that region. Just like communism was the ideology that was salient in the former Soviet Union, and democracy was the ideology that was salient during the Cold War from the Western perspective. But that's all of that complication, this nuance doesn't exist, unfortunately, in the public discourse about terrorism. So again, if you are religious, the automatic view is, ooh, you might be recruited by ISIS or Al-Qaeda. After that, you get into the secular dissident. So this is someone who's perceived as not being religious. You might be Muslim by name, but you're not viewed as someone who's really that devout, which makes you assimilated, right, into the secularized American society. But you're a dissident, meaning that you oppose the war in Iraq, you oppose the occupation of Afghanistan by the US, you oppose America's position on the Arab-Israeli conflict, which tends to be, and I mean, this is factually supported, very in favor of the state of Israel, and not so much in favor of the perspective of Palestinians, particularly vis-a-vis their human rights and their civil rights, that you oppose America supporting dictatorships in the Middle East. You oppose America failing to punish Saudi Arabia for the government's involvement in slaughtering, like a butcher, Jamal Khashoggi. It's disgusting what they did. And yet, no problem, right? Mohammed bin Salman is our friend because we sell them billions of dollars in military equipment. Well, there are people who don't accept that in the US. And if you're Muslim and you oppose that, that can be perceived as, and that's a dissident view. And again, if you're secular, it's less dangerous. But if you're religious, then the perception is, ooh, are you with ISIS? Rather than, no, I'm just exercising my American First Amendment right. And I don't think that should necessarily invite or attract suspicion of my loyalty, because I know it doesn't do that for whites. If you're white male Protestant or white female Protestant, that's seen as, okay, that's fair. We're going to agree to disagree, and we're going to have a debate about international politics. Then the least threatening and the most assimilated is the person who's perceived, again, as secular and not political or mainstream political. In other words, okay, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, I don't really have any dissident views, but I'm secularized. And that person is the most tolerated, the most welcome. Those are the Muslims we want if we have to have Muslims, right? And we do have to have Muslims because a lot of them are engineers and doctors and CEOs, and they're extremely successful economically, and they contribute to the economy. And that's why this country welcomes immigrants. And so we've always had this tension between xenophobia, which is an American tradition, and the history shows it, against the Chinese, against the Japanese, against the Italians, against the Irish, against the Jews, right? And against the Middle Easterners, at least those that are, but we need them as a country because we need their labor. Right? This country is, the genius of this country is the ability to engage in brain gain at the cost of brain drain of other societies. So we have to accept that we have immigrants and diversity, but then it's like, what are the conditions? And then finally, there's the former Muslim. And I just want to note that because this was something that was really devastating, I think, for us. And people who weren't Muslim didn't realize it, but there was a small cadre, and they often were women, which I don't think was a coincidence, of women who were born Muslim, used to be Muslim, and they're free to convert out of the faith. But they didn't just convert out of the faith. They then went on these speaking circuits to far right-wing political circles who ended up being kind of those who supported Trump once he came up in power, and would go around the country and would write books, which I cited in the book, saying that Islam is in fact violent. It does teach Muslims to be violent. It is misogynistic. It is evil. It is savage. And they would be used as what is often called a native informant in the colonial era literature. And nobody would call them out and say, what's your motives? How much are you getting paid for this? Who's paying you? Because there is, and this is all documented, both in my book, but even before I cite other people who have documented this, there is an Islamophobia industry, and it's lucrative. And I think the latest numbers show that it's, since 9/11, there's been at least $70 million pumped into it. So imagine you're a community where an ecosystem of nonprofit and civil society organizations, number one goal, sole goal, is to spend $70 million to vilify you, to ostracize you, to criminalize you, to infringe on your civil liberties and civil rights, right? Including professors like me, simply because we are not going to accept this vilification and these stereotypes, and we're going to call it out for what it is, which is racism, which is a violation of religious freedom, which is anti-American. And those women have been used as tools in that. And so then the response is, I'm not Islamophobic because look, I have this Muslim friend.
So I can relate to a lot of what you've said. As you know, my family is Iranian. My parents came to the US in the mid-70s. They had plans to return to Iran after my father finished engineering school. The revolution happened, and then they decided to build their lives in America. Obviously, we know during that time there was a lot of tension, conflict between the US and Iran, anti-Iranian sentiment in the US. And my parents did their best to just blend in. They were trying to get by, they were trying to survive. And there wasn't necessarily time to think about what's the best way to preserve our culture in a society that doesn't really want us here. They needed to have the ability for their children to succeed in this new place. And in a lot of cases, that meant hiding their cultural identity. In some cases, that meant encouraging their children not to be so forthright when it came to disclosing their cultural identity. And I can't say I blame them for it. But people with other cultural and religious backgrounds have had to contend with what it means to assimilate in America. So in your opinion, what differentiates the Muslim experience in America with that of Jews, Catholics, Mormons? What's the difference in experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's why I spent the first 3 chapters of the book. It was actually a really fulfilling and intellectually challenging journey for me to write the first 3 chapters, because that's probably the part of the book that really expanded my own thinking and expertise. The second half of the book was what I knew well, and what I'd been working on for 20 years. Those first 3 chapters, because I asked that same question. We always ask that question because I'm also a comparativist, at least in the in international relations context. And the answer is, it's not that different, except the context is different. So the time, the historical era is different. The identity obviously is different. And the politics of that time is different, because in the first 3 chapters, so I compare Muslims with Jews, Catholics, and Mormons. And the reason I picked those 3 religions is, one, it's a religious identity, because I was really interested in how does religion racialize, right? How does religion do the work that what we know as skin color? So in America, phenotype does a lot of work in racialize, meaning your skin color, your hair texture, your facial features, right? The way you look. That's what causes people to categorize you within this hierarchy. And the reason why it matters is because, unfortunately, it's not anything anyone wants, but there's a difference between what you want and desire and aspire and what actually happens. And what actually happens is, when you're fit into a particular race that is not the majority race, that is not the race at the top, then there are real material negative consequences, right? You're presumed to be something bad, not smart, lazy, violent, dangerous, savage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? We can apply that. And that's where the stereotyping is unique to the identities, though there's overlap. So there are certain stereotypes for African-American men, African-American women, Asian men, Asian women, right? Latino men, Latino women, et cetera. We can go on the list. And so my book is really looking and exploring the Muslim identity. And if you look back in history, if you look at it started around the 1890s, but it really hit full throttle around 1900 because of the immigration pattern. Starting in 1890, you were getting millions per year of immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and Ireland, and they were not Protestant. there were some of them that were Protestant, and there were obviously immigrants coming from other parts of Northwest Europe that were Protestant, but but it was disproportionately Jewish and Catholic. And those of you who have studied Europe, and I'm not a Europe expert, but we all know, it's kind of common knowledge, that Europe does have its own hierarchy, right, of that one could say is racial or ethnic. And historically, the northern western part of Europe has been at the top, right? And the southern and eastern has been at the bottom. We're kind of seeing a little of that with the conflict with Ukraine and Russia. And anyway, so those people from Italy and from Eastern Europe and the Catholics from Ireland were considered inferior in the European context. And this was a country that was controlled by immigrants from Europe, particularly from Northwest Europe, particularly from England and Germany, right? And some other parts of, and Scandinavia. And but they were legally white, and that's what makes it so interesting. So they could naturalize, because there was a law in 1790 that said you could not naturalize if you were an immigrant to be a US citizen unless you were white. That didn't affect African Americans. They were enslaved, but even when they were liberated, they were all born here. So they weren't immigrants. And however, even though they were white legally, they were not white socially. And yes, their phenotype did matter, because people from Italy don't all look the same as people from Germany or people from England. Obviously, there's diversity within the countries themselves, but their religion played a big role. And Catholics were often criticized as being disloyal. Well, people thought they were more loyal to the Pope than they were to America. I remember JFK's speech to Protestant ministers in 1960, reassuring them, I reassure you that I'm loyal to the US, not to the Pope. The fact that he had to do that speaks volumes about anti-Catholic bias or racism. Similarly with Jews, they were suspected of being there was the whole Jewish conspiracy, the International Protocols of Zion. They were a cabal trying to control the country and the world, that they were more loyal to their enclaves rather than to the country. And there's all sorts of anti-Semitic stereotypes that many of us are familiar with through studying these things in school. And the Mormons were even more fascinating, because they were mostly Scandinavian and Northwest European origin. So they actually looked white in the hierarchy of whiteness and the social construction of whiteness. They looked like those who were at the top, but their religion expelled them from that socially. And it was polygamy was one of the reasons. There were other reasons, but polygamy was then used to show that they were heathens and they were like the Mohammedan Turks. And so Islam was used as a foil. So when people would criticize Catholics, they would say, well, we don't know if these people are loyal except to their Pope, similar to Muslims being only loyal to their Ottoman Sultan. And for Mormons, this polygamy is heathenistic, and it's like these heathen savage Muslims of the Ottoman Empire. And remember, the Ottoman Empire was, in fact, a very serious geopolitical competitor and threat to Europe. If those of you who have studied the boundaries, and at some point Greece was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans were controlled by the European Empire, and parts of Eastern Europe. So that also is coming to the US and imported kind of implicitly. So yes, there are similarities. The differences tend to be that, with the very small exception of those coming from Albania and Bosnia, they came in the early 20th century. Many of them have assimilated. Some of them have still kind of retained their identity, and they have mosques that are predominantly people from the Balkans. But most of the Muslims came, there were the African-American Muslims, but they were part of the Nation of Islam, which was a Black liberation movement, and they weren't foreign. And they were racialized in their intersectional identity as a domestic security threat, similar to the Black Panthers, right? Similar to the civil rights movement, similar to Martin Luther King, who was surveilled by J. Edgar Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover targeted him in COINTELPRO. We all lionize him now, but he was an enemy of the state when he was alive. Post-1965, the immigration laws change. And the national quotas that had been imposed in 1924, and why were the 1924 national quotas imposed? To keep out Eastern European Jews and to keep out Italian Catholics. That was the purpose. And so from 1924 until 1965, 70% of people who immigrated to the US were from Germany, from England, and from Ireland. Now, I don't know the details as to their religious identity, especially from Ireland and Germany. Germany is predominantly Lutheran and Protestant, but they also have a significant Catholic population that has immigrated here. 1965, we get rid of those national quotas. The Asian exclusion laws have been repealed starting in the 1950s. And now people coming to the US are coming from where? Primarily from Asia, which is large, East and South Asia, from the Middle East, from North Africa, from Africa. And so what you have is a complete transformation and diversification, at least in terms of origin, of the American population, those who were immigrating here. And that's why Stephen Miller, who was the senior advisor to Trump, wanted to change immigration laws. Oh, and you also started, of course, to get the Central Americans who were coming. Although Mexicans have always been we can talk about how the borders crossed Mexico, and it wasn't the Mexicans that came, but that also was happening concurrently with that. So it's more complicated with Muslims because Muslims are such a diverse group. They're more diverse than Jews, and they're more diverse than Catholics in that era, in the era of the 20th century in terms of their origins. I'm not saying that there isn't a diversity of Catholics, global Catholicism, global Jewry, but we're talking about the immigrants who are coming here. So just to give you guys an idea, you have about, the low estimate is 4 million, the high estimate is 8. I think it's probably around 6 million Muslims in America. The reason it's hard to know is because the census doesn't ask for your religious identity. So let's say you have 6 million Muslims in America. That's barely 2% of the population, if even that. And 30% of them are African American. 30% of them are from the Middle East and North Africa. Some were born here, some immigrated. 30% are South Asian. Again, some born here, some immigrated. 5% Latino, which is the largest growing population that's converting to Islam in America. And then 5% are multiracial. So that's very different than the origins, right? The national origins of Jewish Americans and Catholic Americans in the 20th century.
So if you look at the 2020 hate crimes data, you'll find, if you look at it as a whole, that almost 62% of hate crime victims were targeted because of the race, ethnicity, and ancestry bias. So as America is becoming more and more diverse religiously, ethnically, culturally, what are the pathways forward for us to come closer to achieving this ideal of religious freedom, defeating racism? What do you see as the way forward?
There is no silver bullet. There's no panacea. It's an evolving process. America is just an intriguing country because on the one hand, it's this really remarkable experiment that maybe could never have gotten where it is now anywhere else. Its biggest strength is also its arguably biggest curse. Its strength is the diversity. There's always fresh ideas, creativity, people coming in. I mean, we're constantly getting the best and the brightest and the most hardworking people from across the world, at least when we're looking at immigration. And obviously, we also have those who are here. We have our differences. And there's so many studies that have been done about just studies for businesses about how important it is not to have groupthink, how important it is to have people who can think outside the box. And the way you do that is by putting people together who have different life experiences, who have different disciplines professionally, who have different work experience. And so the science shows that if you're trying to produce creativity and invention and progress at a massive scale, that is a formula that's very effective. The curse is that means that it's easy for things to become balkanized, to become tribal. And this is where identity politics is both a sword and a shield. I mean, identity politics is, in my view, in my opinion, or my analysis, a survival mechanism, right? Because if you are a member of a collective that is being collectively punished or collectively stereotyped, and you're not given the opportunity to show your own merit, to be treated as an individual, which is what the majority group gets. One, just as an example, DHS is not going around creating countering violent extremism programs and white churches and saying, oh, let's all get together and find out, why is Christianity teaching people to lead an insurgency? Why is Christianity teaching people to join the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or the Ku Klux Klan or the Christian identity movement? Well, because Christianity doesn't have anything to do with it. People use Christianity and other ideologies to justify their desire for a race war, or their belief that the races should be separated and that that's God's will, and all sorts of white supremacist, racist thinking. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all Christians now need to be under the microscope and have tens of millions of dollars targeting their churches to say, let's do community outreach, which is what the government did to Muslim communities. And if you guys want to know more about that, you can read my article, Policing Terrorists in the Community, which was published in the Harvard National Security Journal in 2014. And you can find it online. Because white people get the benefit of their individual acts and beliefs. But when you're a member of a minority and you're collectively punished and stereotyped, so then you have to stick together because you feel like you're being attacked as a group. So you unite. And that actually has a very empowering effect. But it also has an effect where then you don't have as much individuality. You have to stick together. If you look at, for example, the literature on intersectionality of Black women during the civil rights movement, they were in somewhat of a bind. And I'll say Muslim women experience the same thing post 9/11. Their communities are being attacked. There's all sorts of anti-Black racism. They're trying to combat Jim Crow laws and fight for civil rights. But then within the Black community, like within any community, there's misogyny and there's patriarchy. And how do you make sure that you're not oppressed as a woman while still defending the rights of Blacks, right? Well, you may not have that luxury because as soon as you start to criticize your community, your opposition and those people who are trying to oppress your community will use you as a token. And so identity politics has its own negative impact within the intra-community differences. So all that is to say that it's very difficult for us to just solve things like that. My personal approach to all of this, or my scholarly approach, is we have to name it. The problem with the colorblind narrative, or problem with the kumbaya, let's all just get along and everything's great and America's wonderful and this American exceptionalism, is that it doesn't want to recognize the different lived experiences of the various minorities in the society who are not positive experiences, that are not positive experiences. And it's the way in which we produce knowledge, the way in which the media selectively identifies the stories or edits, or think of all the gatekeepers of knowledge and public discourse, is very much centered around those who have power. And those who have power are usually, by definition, not suffering as much and not harmed as much by the system. And therefore, if you don't recognize that, then you will look at the Black Lives Matter and go, why are the Black people so upset? I don't understand. Oh, they must be thugs. This must be a riot. No, it's a rebellion. And the reason why it's a rebellion is because Black men have been shot at in the back for, well, we could say centuries, but at least for the past few decades, post-civil rights movement, and police aren't being held accountable. And the law lets them get away with it. The law is part of the problem with qualified immunity, and the judges and the juries and the police officers. And that's not a statement to say all police officers are bad, but it is a statement to say that that law enforcement as a system is anti-Black, because these outcomes can't be acceptable. And they wouldn't be acceptable if it was your children or if it was your community, right? If you were the one who was worried about your Black child, who any kind of contact with the police could lead to his death. And that in this society, he's more likely to come into contact with the police because of racial profiling, right? So to me, the most important thing we have to do, and I say this as a scholar, right, and also as a former civil rights lawyer, is we have to identify the problem. We have to study it from the lens of those that are, as Derek Bell said, from at the bottom of the well. And be humble and be modest. So I'm privileged, I know that. There are some contexts where I'm not privileged. So being even able to recognize that here's where I'm privileged, here's where I'm not privileged, and that can intersect. And there are things I'm privileged at now that I was not privileged with when I was a teenager. Right? So one of the things that, I I don't know how many people know this about me, and I'm happy to publicly disclose it, but we were very poor growing up in America. We didn't have any money because my father was a graduate student. My mom had to redo her bachelor's degree because her bachelor's degree in Egypt didn't count. In the US, she couldn't work with it. And a family of graduate students with children, you don't make a lot, you don't have any money. And so I know what poverty is like. It's absolutely awful and disempowering. But I'm not poor now, right? And so it would be very easy for me as someone who maybe had never experienced poverty, and not because we were lazy, and not because we didn't want to work, and not because we were, wards of the state, but because my parents were getting their education, and then they started to work, and we needed the social welfare programs to help us get to where we needed to go, rather than have a vicious cycle. So this anti-poverty, we're a very, very anti-poverty country, and it's not a coincidence that it does overlap with race, right? So racism, I think, is a big feeder of our anti-poverty ideology that we have in this country. And I wonder if we could somehow disconnect racism from it, would we be as hostile to poor people as we are?
So at the Miller Center, we've been struck in our work by the self-isolation of vulnerable populations in various locations, not just from the majority population and its institutions, but also from each other. And there are instances, in fact, where vulnerable populations have been the source of hate directed at other vulnerable populations. So in your opinion, shouldn't there be greater outreach across religions based on shared vulnerabilities that they have?
Yes, but that's difficult because part of the hierarchies, and again, hierarchies are not unique to the US. It's just the difference is what's the criteria for the hierarchies, what are the consequences, how are they created? But here, again, I call it a racial religious hierarchy, and it always intersects with class. So that's just a given that within each category within the hierarchy, there is a class division. In other words, wealthy whites are more privileged than poor whites. That's it's not that, if I'm poor and I'm white, but poor whites are more privileged than poor blacks, right? And that's where class intersects. So the hierarchy intentionally thrives based on inter-community strife, especially at the lower levels, because it's a distraction. Because if those at the very bottom are fighting with each other, they're distracted from changing the system, from saying, wait a minute. And you see this in labor unions, right? Where you have labor unions that historically were very racist and anti-Black. And yet they were representing the working class, which were poorer than obviously the middle and upper middle classes and wealthy. And yet they were fighting each other because it was seen as a zero-sum game. It was treated as a zero-sum game. And the pool was limited. And then you have the identity politics coming into play. And as opposed to saying, well, can we have an alliance based on our class rather than just based on our race and class? Well, most people would agree with that. I think a lot of African Americans, I'm not speaking for African Americans, but if we talk about it in the abstract, I think you could get people who are racial minorities who are of the same class as whites to ally. The problem is that racism still plays a role. And so you are looking for people you can trust. You are looking for people who will not throw you under the bus and say, no, we're going to be united. And that's the challenge, is how can you, as a minority community who feels the brunt of discrimination in a particular context or multiple contexts, not see another minority that's also facing discrimination or subordination, maybe in a different context or maybe in the same, work together to change the system. The other problem is that there's a lot of internalization of stereotypes and bias and prejudice. Sometimes it's internalized and you engage in self-loathing against your own community, even at a subconscious level. Sometimes it's internalized against another community, and you may not realize that, wait a minute, I'm doing the same thing to them that I am claiming broader society is doing to me, right? And so that also takes some work to identify. But remember, when you are under attack or when you feel that you're under siege, in other words, you feel that You're always vulnerable to employment discrimination. You're vulnerable to disparate treatment in schools, disparate disciplining. You're vulnerable to racial profiling by the police. You're vulnerable to surveillance by the national security. You're vulnerable to patriarchy. Your state of mind is not one where you're necessarily trying to help other people. You're often just trying to survive. And that, I think, makes it also more difficult. It requires more work and more thinking. And this is where I think the Eagleton Institute can play a role. I know it has. It's where my center plays a role. This is where you really need institutions to be thinking outside the box and not relying on individual communities, because I don't think it's fair or equitable and I don't think it's reasonable for us to expect communities who are under siege in various ways to have to fix the problem. They're not creating the problem, they're just surviving the problem. That's why it's so important, if you do have privilege, whether it's economic, racial, gender, a combination, a professional privilege, you have a bigger burden. I think we need to flip the script, and we need to start imposing a higher burden on those with privileges, against it's very context specific, to do more work to fix the problems, rather than say, well, they don't want to help themselves. Well, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you can't even afford childcare, you have no job security, your wages are stagnant. How are you can barely survive. Why? You shouldn't have to bear any more burden. You shouldn't even be having to experience that in the richest country in the world, right? This is where the anti-poverty ideology just seeps through everything, which I do think is somewhat related to our version of capitalism. So I'm not an anti-capitalist, but I do think that the way that we enforce or implement capitalism is not in the public interest. And there's a documentary I would recommend people watch. It's a bit dated. It's called The Flaw. And it talks about why the subprime mortgage crisis happened. It's really fascinating. But I think it exposes how our severe and worsening wealth inequality in America over the last 50, 60 years has, to me, exposed that our version of capitalism, I think, is a national security threat. I really do. I think it creates social instability and social polarization and conflict. And that also needs to be tied in with, the extent to which wealth inequality is even overly or disproportionately experienced by racial minorities.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. This has been fascinating. I could chat with you all day. But I just want to thank you so very much for joining us today. I enjoyed your book. I enjoyed our conversation. For our audience, if you haven't gotten a copy of the book yet, you can visit Eagleton's website to purchase it from the University of California Press and other booksellers. We'll also be sharing a video of our talk today and encourage all of you to share it with your networks. Thank you to our audience for tuning in, and we hope to see you at one of our many upcoming Eagleton events this year. Thank you again. Take care. Sahar, great to see you. Thank you so much. And congratulations again.
Thank you. And one final note, if you are a prospective law student, contact me. I will respond to you. We want more lawyers who will fight for social justice in corporate law, in government, in any area of law. So I hope that this has motivated and inspired the students. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to follow my path. But we need more lawyers that are committed to preserving our democracy. Thank you for offering to serve in that mentor capacity for our students. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.